Hello and welcome to this presentation on sexual assault, consent, and bystander intervention as part of the Be the Creed workshop. So my name is Emily and I'm going to go ahead and get started explaining what peer education is and then we'll jump right in. So peer education is a group of students on BGSU's campus who go around to different departments, different organizations, different offices on campus, and we give presentations on different health and wellness topics. So today we'll talk about sexual assault, consent, and bystander intervention, but we also talk about alcohol and other drugs. We talk about healthy relationships, stress survival, self-care. There's a lot of them. You can find them on our website. So typically these presentations are done in person, but we also have these online resources as well. And if you're interested in learning more about these presentations or becoming a peer educator, you can visit the BGSU Wellness Connection website. On that website, we also have a list of resources. So these are things like the Counseling Center, the Health Center, psychological services. So if you need any of those now or throughout this presentation, know that they are there and open for you to use. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Be the Creed workshop. So Be the Creed is a workshop series at BGSU that is available. This is one of the sessions, but there are other sessions that go along with it. And they really focus on shared governance and shared responsibility for the BGSU community. So this presentation is one of multiple. In this series, we also have the alcohol and other drugs presentation, which is also presented by health and wellness peer educators. But we also have presentations on diversity and inclusion that are presented by the Office of Multicultural Affairs ambassadors, as well as collaborating with ambassadors from the Center for Leadership as well, the SLAs. So you can choose to watch just this video, or you can choose to watch our other Be the Creed video as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the purpose of this presentation. So as I said, this presentation is about sexual assault, consent, and bystander intervention. And so the purpose of the presentation is really just to give you the information needed to inform you about these topics. The presentation will give you terminology, skills, dialogue, just needed to make you more aware of the topics presented, make more informed decisions, and be an active bystander. So by listening to this presentation, we do not assume that you engage in sexual activities. The aim of this presentation is just to provide you with more information surrounding these sexual activities, consent, and bystander intervention. And the information presented throughout this presentation is sensitive in nature. So if at any time you feel like you need to turn it off or leave the room, please feel free to do so. And then if you're comfortable and able to reach out to those resources that we have posted on the BGSU Wellness Connection website if you need to. So our goal for this presentation is for you to understand the topics presented and feel comfortable becoming an active bystander. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first activity. So our first activity is going to be a myth or fact game. So I'm going to read you a question and then you're going to guess whether or not it's a myth or a fact. So we have a few here. So our first one, the primary motive for rape is purely sexual. Is that a myth or is that a fact? So that's a myth. The motive for rape is aggression and power, not sex. So rapists have a desire to dominate, humiliate, and degrade their victims. So for our next question, in about 90% of assaults, the victim knew the offender. Myth or fact? So that's a fact. On college campuses, sexual assaults are committed more often by a partner, an ex-partner, a classmate, a friend, an acquaintance, or a coworker rather than by a stranger. Our next question is drug and alcohol facilitated rape victims are less likely to report the crime than other rape victims. So this means people under the influence of alcohol and drugs are less likely to report. So that is a fact. Drug and alcohol facilitated rape victims often feel responsible or as if they simply drank too much or they can't remember what happened, while the victim is never to blame. Our next question is if a person is wearing a certain type of clothing, they are asking for sex. That is a myth. No one is asking to be sexually assaulted. So even if you're wearing sexy or revealing clothing, that's not asking for sex. Our next question is, according to national surveys, 1 in 4 women will be victims of completed or attempted rape throughout their college experience. 1 in 4 women. Myth or fact? So that is a fact. Statistics range between 20 to 25% of college women and 15% of college men. And when you compare this to TGQN, so transgender, genderqueer, and nonconforming college students. So 21% of transgender, genderqueer, and nonconforming college students have been sexually assaulted. So 21% compared to 18% of non-TGQN females and only 4% of non-TGQN males. Our next question is, a faculty member is considered a confidential resource when discussing a sexual assault. So this means if you were to talk to a professor or any other faculty member, they would not have to report. So that is false. Faculty, staff, and RAs are responsible employees, which means that they must report a sexual assault or an act of sexual violence when receiving information regarding it. Other non-confidential sources, so other people who have to report, would include the BGSU and BG Police, the Office of the Dean of Students, and the Title IX office, whereas confidential resources would include the Counseling Center, Psychological Services, Falcon Health, as well as the Wood County Hospital, and the Cocoon. Our next question is, if the prosecutor will not move forward with a sexual assault case, that means the BGSU student cannot move forward with the student conduct process. So that is false. The criminal process and the student code of conduct process are very separate. So a student can decide to make a criminal report and not participate in the student code of conduct process. They can choose to participate in the student code of conduct process but not the criminal process. They can choose to do both, or they can choose to do neither. So the decision is really up to the student unless there's a threat to the campus safety. Our next question is, social media is not a way in which students should report acts of sexual violence. So this is true. If you want to post on social media about an act of sexual violence that happened to you, you're more than welcome to, but we don't want that to be the only thing that you do. We want you to go through using an official mechanism to report. So that could be the Report It feature from BGSU. It could also be the police, the Office of the Dean of Students, the Title IX office, an RA, or another responsible employee. And that would be best, because when things are posted on social media, we may not be able to get the resources that you need in a timely manner, and the safety of our campus community could be compromised. And then our last question is, the Cocoon is the local rape crisis center that has victim advocates that can provide support to members of the BGSU community who have been affected by sexual violence. Myth or fact? So this is a fact. The Cocoon provides victim advocates 24/7, and you can get them by calling the Cocoon's phone number, as well as they provide victim advocates who can be with you throughout the entire process and beyond. So thank you for participating in that game. So we're going to move on a little bit to talk about sexual assault first, and then we'll kind of transition into consent, and then we'll end with bystander intervention. So for our first question, so thinking about what is sexual assault, what would a broad definition be? The definition of sexual assault, according to the Ohio Revised Code, would be any unwanted sexual conduct or contact without the person's consent. So then talking a little bit about the different elements, it says without consent. So talking about what consent really is. So there are a lot of different elements to consent. So consent must be a clear agreement to engage in a particular activity, and the person who initiates the sexual activity is responsible for obtaining consent for that activity. Consent must be expressed outwardly through mutual understandable words or actions, and the person who initiates the sexual activity may not infer consent from silence, passivity, or lack of resistance. A person who is incapacitated may not give consent. Consent must be voluntarily given. It cannot be obtained through coercion or force. Consent cannot be inferred from a previous or existing dating or sexual relationship. Consent to one sexual activity is not consent to another sexual activity, nor is it consent to the same sexual activity at another time. A person may withdraw consent at any time. If consent is withdrawn, the sexual activity must stop immediately. And then to determine under this policy if consent was sought and given, BGSU will evaluate what the responding party knew and reasonably should have known when all relevant circumstances are considered. A person who is incapacitated may not give consent, and incapacitation means that the person lacks the ability to make an informed, rational judgment about a sexual activity. So under the BGSU policy, a person who initiates a sexual activity with another person who actually knows or reasonably should have known that the person was incapacitated has not obtained consent. So incapacitated could include asleep, unconscious, unaware of what's taking place, as well as being physically or mentally helpless. So a person may become incapacitated due to a temporary or permanent physical or mental condition, or due to the consumption of alcohol or drugs. And then when drugs or alcohol are involved, incapacitation is a state beyond drunkenness or intoxication. So if a person using drugs or drinking does not necessarily have to be incapacitated, rather it's their level of impairment that is going to be significant enough to render whether the person was unable to give consent, but obviously sober consent is always best. Consent can also not be gained through coercion or force. Coercion is conduct that would reasonably place a person in fear and that is used to compel that person to engage in the sexual activity. So this could include intimidating someone as well as expressing or implying threats of immediate or future harm to the person or to others. It could also be harm that could be physical as well as emotional, reputational, financial, or another injury to that person or to another person. And then force. So force would be the use of physical action, so strength or violence, to compel a person to participate in a sexual activity. And then if you're interested in reading more about these policies, feel free to visit the BGSU Student Code of Conduct Handbook, which is available on the BGSU website. So any action or behavior that violates Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act of 1972 would be a violation of the BGSU policy. So as we kind of talked about some of those elements here. So taking a second to, as we just went through all of those different elements of consent, maybe coming up with an example of when consent could be withdrawn. So consent can be withdrawn either before or during any sexual act. And then what effects could drugs have on consent? So sober consent is always ideal, and then why does prior sexual activity or relationship not constitute consent in and of itself? And so this is because you can withdraw consent at any time. So you could consent to an act once and not consent to it at a different time. You can consent to one act and not another act. This is completely based on that specific time, and you must ask for consent every time. And then our last question are, what are some of the consequences of forcing consent? So forcing consent would be considered sexual assault. So some consequences of forcing consent could be legal action as well as harm to the people who are involved, both physically, emotionally, and mentally. So now that you kind of understand some of the myths and facts about sexual assault, you understand the definitions of sexual assault, you understand what consent is and the different elements that make up consent, we're going to kind of move a little bit into bystander intervention. So with bystander intervention, we have a YouTube video. It is the Who Are You video. So I have the link here. You can also find it in the description or on the BGSU Wellness Connection website. And then just taking a minute to watch this video. It's a few minutes long, and then we'll talk about it at the end. And just a little bit of a warning that this video does depict the events leading up to a sexual assault. So if at any time that you are uncomfortable, feel free to stop the video. So as you've kind of watched this video and watched these events unfold and then watched the events rewind, just what were some of your reactions to the video? Were there any things that you noticed? Was there anything that was concerning to you? How did watching the video make you feel? And then we're going to kind of go through the different people who were in the video. So the best friend, who at the beginning did not involve herself at all, but then the best friend came in and was like, hey, let's go home, and then she takes her away. So that would be a way to directly intervene in that situation. as well as the bartender. So the bartender was like, not direct, but like, who were you here with? Like noticing that something seemed wrong. So then he got her friends and they were able to help her in that situation. So the roommate at the beginning didn't really do much, just kind of watched it happen, closed the door. But then as the roommate came back in the second time, really stepped up and helped her to get to her room, as well as saying, okay, if you're going to stay here, you're sleeping on the couch. Really just creating that distance, and then he ended up leaving. So the next would have been the stranger, so that person in line who just reached out to the bouncer, who then was able to intervene. So you can delegate to another person. So whether it's a bartender, whether it's a bouncer, if you're not at a bar, there are other people you can always go to an RA or anyone else who's around. You can also just delegate to a group of people. And with that, just understanding that you don't have to directly intervene. So then the bouncer was able to go and intervene and get her out of the situation. And then thinking about whether or not the things that you have seen in this video you think happen often. Do you think these situations of just people looking away, the first half of the video, or do you think the second half of the video is more accurate? And so we know that there's lots of reasons that people choose not to intervene in a situation, and there's lots of reasons that you might not intervene in a situation. So thinking for a second about what are some reasons that people may not help or intervene in a situation. So some ideas that we have here are that people assumed it was not their problem. They said it's none of my business. They assumed someone else would help, which would be the bystander effect of everybody assuming someone else will help. Other people around them didn't seem concerned. They didn't know how to help, or they felt it was not safe to help. So those are some of the reasons that people might not intervene, but there are a lot of costs that come to not intervening. So you could have personal guilt or shame if something were to happen to that person, or even if something weren't to happen to that person and you just didn't know. The situation could definitely worsen if you weren't to intervene. Someone could be harmed or injured, or a situation could even result in death. So it's definitely important to intervene in these situations, and you might not always have to directly intervene. So we're going to talk about the 3Ds. So those are the 3 ways that you could potentially intervene in a situation. So the first strategy for intervening would be directly intervening. So you can be direct by confronting the situation where someone else is being harmed or at risk of being harmed. In the case of witnessing a fight, a direct approach might involve asking the students who were fighting if everything's all right, or asking other people in the room if they were uncomfortable with the situation as you were. So you could directly intervene. However, if you're not comfortable directly intervening in all situations, the next D would be distract. So in a situation that involves more than one person, you can also distract one or both of the people involved. So some ideas for distractions could be complimenting someone on their clothing or on something else to get their attention onto you versus the other person. You could also tell someone that their car is getting ticketed. You could also spill a drink on someone and then help them to clean up. There are lots of different ideas of ways that you can distract someone to kind of get the attention away from the situation that's at hand, and you don't have to directly intervene, especially if you don't know what's wrong. You can always be like, hey, do I know you like from my accounting class? And people will be likely, if they need help, to start talking to you or to try, and they might be confused at first, but try and get out of that situation. Third D would be delegate. So this is if you don't feel comfortable directly intervening or even distracting, you can always delegate. So you can delegate by looking for people who can back you up when it's time to intervene. So depending on the situation, this could mean from other people who are around you, having power in numbers, going up as a group. You could also delegate, as we talked about, to an RA, to a bartender, to a bouncer, to anyone else who is there, who is kind of in charge of what's happening. And then in extreme cases, you definitely could delegate to the police as well if that is necessary. And then delegating is great because it can create a shared sense of responsibility among the community members. And this doesn't have to be just used in terms of alcohol and drugs. This can also be used in terms of any other situation in which you want to help someone. We're going to talk about some of the campaigns and some of the things on BGSU's campus now that you could get involved in if you are interested in learning more about this. And just thinking for a second if you know of any campaigns or anything that helps promote the behaviors that we've talked about and some ways that you could become an active bystander. So here at BGSU, there's multiple ways to get involved and to learn how to become an active bystander, as well as be involved to make BGSU campus a safer place, and to spread awareness about sexual assault while teaching others that sexual assault is unacceptable at BGSU and anywhere else. So some of the ways that you could get involved in BGSU is the It's On Us campaign. So that is a cultural movement aimed towards fundamentally shifting the way that we think about sexual assault. It's On Us is a rally cry inviting everyone to step up and realize the solution begins with us. And it's a declaration that sexual assault is not only a crime committed by a perpetrator against a victim, but it's a societal problem in which we all have a role to play. We also have the Step Up, Step In campaign, which is an initiative funded by the Department of Higher Education aimed to reduce the risk of incidents of relationship violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sexual harassment. And so you can do your part by stepping up and stepping in to create a culture of shared respect at BGSU. You can also request this presentation in person or send it to people online as well to kind of spread the word about bystander intervention, and then you can also become a peer educator and teach others about these topics. So our next question would be, why do you think it's important to know how to be an active bystander and to help in potential situations? So taking a second to think about that, we've kind of gone through a lot of reasons throughout this presentation on why it's important to be an active bystander, and you've seen that video as well, and really challenging yourself to think about what you do in your daily life. Are you typically stepping up and being a bystander, or do you typically watch situations happen? And then the last thing we're going to talk about is what to do in a situation where you don't feel like it's safe to intervene. So this is definitely where you're going to use that delegation strategy that we talked about. So you can call the police as well as 911. You could locate local security depending on where you're at. You could ask other people if they notice the same things and approaching them as a group. You could try and make eye contact with the person in need. You can try and cause attention to the location of the incident. You can use distraction methods to get a person away from the situation of harm. Or you can report any incidents that you see to the school as well. And so we have an empowerment statement here that I'm going to read, and then we have one more activity. So our empowerment statement is that there are many differences throughout the people watching this video, throughout BGSU, and throughout the world, but one thing that we all have in common is that we're all human, and as responsible people, it's on each of us to take a stand to prevent sexual assault from occurring, and to step up in any situation that does not seem right. So maybe thinking about how are you going to prevent sexual assault and step up and step in during situations that don't seem right? And as the video asked, who are you? And then knowing that there are situations where you're not sure if something's happening, and always being proactive and stepping in, because the worst thing that's going to happen if you step into a situation where everybody's okay is they're going to be like, yeah, we're fine, everything's fine. But if you risk not intervening in that situation and something could have been happening, there are a lot more risks. So always stepping up, even if you think that a situation might be potentially okay. If you sense that there's something wrong, then there probably is. So for our last activity here, we are going to write down, so grabbing either a piece of paper, or if you're on your phone or your laptop, opening the notes section or a document, and what we need is to write down one thing you want to start doing, one thing you want to stop doing, and one thing you want to continue doing after listening to this presentation. So one thing you want to start doing, one thing you want to stop doing, and one thing that you're already good at that you want to continue doing. So really taking this time to kind of reflect on yourself and the actions that you typically take and the actions that you want to take. So then just kind of a recap after everything that we've talked about with sexual assault, consent, and bystander intervention. So starting with bystander intervention, the ways that we can intervene as an active bystander. So we're first going to notice the event. So becoming aware of your surroundings, anticipating problems, looking for red flags. The first step in helping someone is going to be to notice the event. You cannot help if you are unaware of the problem that may be occurring. Our second step is going to be to interpret the event. So investigating an ambiguous event, even if others seem unconcerned. And the second step is to kind of interpret once you've noticed that the event is occurring and decide if it's a problem or not. The third step would be to assume responsibility. So don't assume that somebody else will do something. Take it upon yourself to step in and enlist others to help. Many times people don't help because nobody else seems concerned, and maybe they think that someone else will be better able to handle the situation. So this is called conformity, and everyone is most likely thinking the same thing that you are. So recruiting the help of other people in the group. So our fourth step is to know how to help. So learning the skills and strategies that can best help others. So we've gone through a lot of these throughout this presentation. And then often people want to help, but they don't know how to do it. So thinking about what steps you would actually take in a variety of situations can better prepare you for that situation if it were ever to occur. So the fifth and final step would be to implement the help. So if it's safe and you're willing to help, implementing your skills. So be the first person to help. This can give others the strength and the permission to act, and there will always be a cost of not intervening. So this could be the fear of rejection, embarrassment, or getting in trouble, but it's always better to act than to not act. And if you don't feel that it's safe or you don't want to actually put yourself into that situation, always delegating to somebody else. And then recapping some of the best practices with consent that we talked about. So consent has to be consistent. If someone has agreed to a sexual activity, they have the right to change their mind at any time. Consent must be verbal, so it's not a nod of the head, a shrug of the shoulders. It's a clear yes or no without mixed signals. Consent must be sober, so consent can only be given if a person is not impaired by drugs or alcohol. Consent must be prompt, so consent must be direct and immediate. If there's hesitation, then consent is not immediate. Consent must be unforced, so consent should never be given because a person was scared or bullied into consenting. And lastly, consent must be enthusiastic. It should be clear and apparent that the person wants to engage in the act. If there's any question, then the answer is no. And then to report concerns about yourself or about others, or file a complaint about a BGSU student in regards to misconduct, sexual assault, sexual harassment, or any other concerning behavior. It does not have to be sexual assault related. You can use the See It, Hear It, Report It feature at BGSU, which you can access through the link that is below. And knowing that there are always the resources available as well on the BGSU Wellness Connection website if you need more resources such as the health center, the counseling center, psychological services. There are also other ones available as well. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I hope that you were able to learn something and really taking that last activity, that one thing you want to start doing, one thing you want to stop doing, and one thing you want to continue doing, and maybe keeping that piece of paper somewhere where you'll see it, or keeping it in the notes of your phone, saving it, screenshotting it, something like that, so that way that you are really able to see this and actually make those changes after today. If you have any other further questions, feel free to reach out to the BGSU Wellness Connection. So our information is here. You can also follow us on Twitter at BGSU Wellness, and have a great day.